All right, Luke 16, going to be looking at verses 1 through 18. First question deals with part of what we're going to look at tonight. It's really not the main part, but hopefully we don't run out of time. We're usually pretty pressed for time at the end, and so it kind of deals with what Jesus talked about at the end. If we don't get to cover it, a couple more lessons, and we'll cover it in some detail. But question number one is, what attitude does our culture have toward divorce today?
They think it's okay.
Okay, I would say it's pretty readily accepted, wouldn't you?
Yes.
In fact, I would say if people would probably find it rare or strange if you haven't been divorced, wouldn't you?
That's correct.
I would say in our society today, a number of people, of course, have been through divorce. What about adultery? What's the attitude of our culture today towards adultery?
No big deal.
Yeah, and it's just general, not even per se, to isolate adultery, but just the attitude in general toward unlawful sex is, it's pretty well accepted, isn't it? Pretty commonly practiced in our society, not frowned upon in any way, not really looked down upon. And so our world has this idea about divorce and about adultery, but as Jesus taught, as Christians, our thinking and our ideas about divorce and adultery should be much different than that of the world. So if we get down to verses 16 and 18, we'll talk about that in more detail. But first we're going to start with the parable of the unjust steward or the wise manager, depending on which version you're reading or studying from. Hopefully, if you haven't already read this, hopefully you remember the story or the parable and some of the things surrounding it. And I will just mention this. This is considered, of all the parables of Jesus, maybe of all the parables in the Bible, this is probably considered one of the most difficult. And why would you think that is? Got any idea?
Verse 8. Because of verse 8.
Verse 8 is really the problem, I think, that a lot of people have in understanding this parable. And you read there that the master commends the unjust steward or the unrighteous manager. And so a lot of people have a question, well, how could God commend an unrighteous manager or unrighteous steward? And I think kind of the main point of the parable gets kind of lost in the minor details of it. But Lord willing, we'll talk a little bit more about it. And what I want you to really focus on as we go through it is, what is the main purpose and point of this parable? Now, I always make mention of, when Jesus gives a parable, I always try to make mention of this fact. There's usually one main point that he has in mind, right? There's one main reason or one main spiritual teaching that he's trying to get across. And so as we're studying this parable, kind of ask yourself the question, what is Jesus trying to teach? What is the application, the main application of this parable? So as you read through the parable, you read about a steward who took a rich man's good and basically he had embezzled his goods. He used them for himself, for his own pleasure. And so question number 2 here, how does the rich man in this parable respond to this steward or manager who had wasted his possessions? First of all, let me ask this question. Why do you think he wasted his master's possessions? Why do you think he embezzled from him?
Why does anybody steal? Selfishness, right?
Okay, selfishness would have been motivation, right? Or in part why he would have done this. Any other factors that you can think of that would have contributed to him doing this? Okay, an example he was following?
Or just laziness and not really doing his job.
Okay, that could be just, didn't want to do anything, so rather use somebody else's stuff or take somebody else's stuff.
Most people think they're going to get away with it too when they're stealing.
Yeah, I mean, if a person believes they're going to be caught when they rob a bank, do you think they'd rob the bank? Well, a sane person wouldn't, would they? If they knew or if they believed, there's a 99.999% chance that I'm going to get caught doing this, I mean, what person in their right mind would say, I'm going to do it anyway? But usually a person steals with the mindset, I'm never going to get caught, right? Or they're never going to be able to pin this on me. I think that's probably one of the main reasons why this man did this. The second thing that I really thought about was he was in a position to do this. Because he was basically entrusted with all of his master's good, who did he answer to? Only one person was his master. And evidently, he didn't think his master kept up with his affairs too well. And so he probably thought, well, I have access to all these different things. They're not mine, but because I have access to them, I'm going to use them for whatever I want to use them for. I'm going to use them for my pleasure. And so the manager finds out about this guy's been wasting his goods and his possessions. And so what does he do? Yeah, he confronts him, and he basically tells him, I'm going to require a final account of you. Okay, you're going to have to come before me, and you're going to have to tell me what has happened to all my things. You're going to answer for what you've done with my goods. So you read about the manager. He's pretty concerned, isn't he? Question number 3, why is the manager scared that he's going to lose his job? First off, think of this. Did he believe that he was going to be fired? Why? Because he was guilty, right? So he knew what was going to happen. He knew the inevitable was coming, right? But he was scared of losing his job, even though he knew that it was coming. And why was he scared? Okay, so the question in his mind is, what am I going to do? I'm going to lose this good job, and I'm going to lose this position, and then what is there left for me to turn to? And as Steve pointed out, he said, evidently, I don't know if he wasn't strong enough or he was too soft or whatever, but he said, I can't dig. I can't go out here and work in a field. I'm too ashamed to beg. I'm not going to go out here and try to bum or beg things off of people. So the question in his mind was, there was no doubt in his mind he was going to get fired. He was guilty. But the question after that was, what am I going to do? And really, if you think about the rest of this story, that's kind of the focus of Jesus and the main point of Jesus. Okay, this guy was concerned, what am I going to do after this happens? How can I prepare myself for what's coming? And so we read about some things that he did. Question number 4 here. So if you look at verses 4 through 7, what does this steward or this manager do to try to make sure that his future is going to be secure? Okay, he
uses the master's money to make friends.
Yeah. So in his mind, again, the question is, what's going to happen to me when I'm fired? What can I do to improve or to help my situation? In other words, what can I do so that when people see me on the street, they're going to say, you lost your job, you don't have a place to stay, why don't you come over and stay with me? Why don't you spend some time with me? Why don't you eat at my table? And so that's his mindset. What can I do here so that in the future I can improve the situation and people will be willing to help him? So his thinking is basically, I've got to do something to secure the favor of men so that when I do lose my job, they're not going to look down upon me, but rather they're going to be willing to help me and willingly invite me into their homes. So what does he do? Yeah. Basically, he goes to these guys who owe his master, and he says, hey, I'll let you off by only paying half. If you'll pay your bill right now, you only have to pay half of it. We'll just write the rest of it off. And so he makes his rounds, and he does that, And in turn, think about what's happening now. He's securing the favor of these men, isn't he? He's securing the favor of these men, and that was really his thinking, what can I do so that when I get fired, I'm going to be in a favorable position. You know, people aren't going to look down upon me and despise me, but they're going to be willing to help me and you know, like me and want me around. And so that's exactly what he did. So you go down to verse 8, and again, this is kind of where a lot of people, you know, I think maybe jump off the main thought of the parable itself. But what does the master do? How does he react to the way that this steward has dealt? He commends him, right? Now, let me ask you this question. What is he commending him for?
His fruit is not his behavior.
Okay. Is it his deceit? Is that what he's approving of and saying, man, that's a great job. You know, that's a good thing that you did out there. No, that's not what he's commending him for. It's his shrewdness, as Wes pointed out there. It's his wisdom. You know, he knew that when he lost this job, he was going to be in a difficult situation. So in his mind, he's asking the question, what can I do to help secure the favor of other men before this happens to me? So he comes up with this plan. He puts this plan into effect. And his master looks at it and he said, that's a pretty smart move, isn't it? You know, you did well for yourself by doing that. And again, it's not that, you know, the main point of this parable is not that Jesus commends deceit. You know, that's not what the idea that Jesus had with this story at all. But the idea was that this guy saw what the future held for him, and he knew he could do something to change it, to make it favorable for him, and he did that. You know, he did whatever he could to secure his future. So it is an interesting application, because how does Jesus kind of apply this whole parable then?
He's using reverse psychology, saying that when he did this, it would embarrass that person to the point that he'd be ashamed of what he did, and he would straighten up and do what's correct. And that's what Jesus is trying to pass on to us, that we need to follow him. And if we get embarrassed, then we'll go back to him and do what's right.
Okay, and specifically though, in verses 8 and 9, Jesus, you know, he just told this story, and then he kind of, you know, draws this spiritual application to it. And what's really the spiritual application?
That's further down. You can't serve two masters. That's not the main point of the parable.
Okay. So if you look at the last part, or the second part of verse 8, here's what he says. He says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd, I'm reading from New King James Version here, more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. What does that mean?
In dealing with one another, especially in the old law, this new one's coming in. I mean, that's what makes the Pharisees so mad over here, because they begin to understand he's talking right about what you always do. And that's what makes them mad at 14. Is they're listening into this, and they figure out, because they've accepted a lot of things to get along with everybody else. A lot of things that were not in the law, everything else that didn't fit in, and the Roman rulers and everything else, and forgot about God.
Okay.
That's basically what goes on in this thing.
Yeah. All that's correct. Like I said, it's getting down further in the chapter here. But I want you guys to think specifically on this statement here. Okay, what did Jesus mean by that? What did he mean when he said the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light?
The worldly people are making preparations for the future events. You use dishonest means or whatever means, but they're making preparations for the future. I want you Christians to prepare for the everlasting.
Yeah, that's
Think ahead.
That's the application of the parable, isn't it? It was, this guy saw his future. His future was dark. he made the effort, he made the plans, he made the effort, and he changed his future, didn't he? You think about worldly-minded people, and that's really, I think, what Jesus is talking about here, the sons of this world and the sons of light. Okay, worldly-minded people, if physically speaking, if they see their future is dark, what are they going to do? They're going to do everything they can to try to change that, aren't they? Or to turn it around. And that's what a smart person does. You know, if you see your future down the road and it's doom and gloom, you say, what can I do to change that? Well, you come up with a plan and you invest all your energy and you put all your effort into it and you try to turn those things around. And as Christians, should we know what the future holds? Should we be able to see the future? Yeah. Do you think that we are as zealous, and I think this is the application here, that we are as zealous for the future of spiritual things as people of the world are for the future of physical things? Do you think we put in as much effort as they do? We put as much effort into spiritual things as they put into physical things. Do you think we put in as much energy? Do you think we really try to fully invest ourselves in spiritual matters in the future?
Well, one issue might be the fact that if you believe that you are in the light, not the darkness, then your attitude toward scrambling or whatever Adam was saying there is it's not going to be as diligent if you believe you're already there. You're already taken care of.
Yeah.
So, I think that's kind of what it's
Yeah, and, again, worldly-minded people, if they're looking at the future and it's not going to be good for them, they devise a plan, they invest energy into it, they do everything that they can in order to try to turn that thing around. They dedicate themselves and they take action, don't they? And I think what Jesus is saying as Christians, spiritually speaking, that's how we ought to be too. We ought to be able to look into the future and we know all these spiritual things that are going to happen. So what should that do to us? It should move us. It should motivate us. We should dedicate ourselves. We should plan and we should do. And I don't know as Christians that we always are motivated like we should be. A lot of times we let the things of the world get in our way. So question number 6 here, I think we kind of covered that. Who are the people of light to whom Jesus refers? Well, I would say they're followers of God, wouldn't you? But again, the point that he's making is these physical people are showing more initiative and more energy and more dedication to physical things than we often do to spiritual things. So, you got me kind of thinking about the idea, we as Christians today, how many people have ever had a Jehovah's Witness knock on their door? Is there anybody who hasn't? That's probably okay, I see one hand. Maybe you weren't home. I understand that Jehovah's Witness teach error. Okay, but are they dedicated?
Very dedicated.
Do they put a lot of planning into what they do? Do they put a lot of energy into it? Do they take action?
They take your children with them?
Yeah, all those things. And so I guess the application, the question for us is, are we as dedicated as they are?
No.
We're not, are we?
We're not.
Well, I'll just say I'm not. I'll let you make your own judgment on yourself. But are people of the world, when it comes to matters that are far less important than truth and spirituality, are they more dedicated than we are as Christians? Are they wiser in what they do? Yeah. And that's really, I think, the application that Jesus is making of the parable here. This guy was wise when it came to physical things. He was dedicated. He planned. He did. And we don't always do the same things as Christians. So we need to have that same type of zeal and dedication that those worldly people have toward worldly things, but as Christians toward spiritual things. So Jesus kind of uses that as a springboard to talk about money and our possessions and resources. So question number 7 is this, according to verse 9, how does Jesus want us to use money?
Just make friends.
Okay, what does he mean by that? Make friends. How do you make friends with money? Well, there's more than one way, isn't there? I see Danny's laughing over there. I can already see his thought process.
I was thinking of the parables of the talents.
Okay.
And so I would like that on that.
Okay. What about helping others? You see somebody in need, you use your money, you use your resources. Can you gain a friend by doing that?
Yes.
You can't. Can you have influence or can you exert influence in a person's life because of that?
Yes.
Absolutely. Right? And a lot of times, again, when we think of whether it's money or possessions or these things, they're always, all those things are gifts from God. Okay? But did God give them to us just to go out and use them up for ourselves however we want? Why do we have those things?
Well, the Bible's specific about why we work is to take care of ourselves and then to take care of those that have need. And then you look at Matthew 16, it's very clear about what he wants us to do with money, lay up treasure in heaven with it.
Yeah. So you have this idea, you know, Jesus gives us these resources. One day, those resources are going to be brought to an end. Our life's going to be brought to an end. And the question is, you know, God gave us these things to be a source of blessing. Did we use them like God wanted us to use them? You know, or did we take them over here and selfishly hoard them for ourselves and, you know, lay them up and say, I'll wait till later in life, and then I'm going to use all this stuff up, you know. And that's not to condemn preparing for the future. That's not to condemn retirement or anything like that, because that's the principle that the Bible teaches. But there's also there's supposed to be an area in our life that is left open for helping other people, isn't it? And so God wants us to use what He has given us for His purposes. To make friends with those things. So what main principle, question number 8 here, what main principle should govern the way we use our resources? You can kind of read that idea there in verses 10 through 12. What's kind of the main word that Jesus talks about there? Faithfulness. Right? And what does that mean? Okay? But when it comes to our resources, if we're going to use our resources faithfully, all right, he talks about he that is faithful in least is faithful in much. He that's, you know, unjust in much is I think I'm going backwards there, but you know what it says. What does he mean by that? How do you be faithful with the resources that God has given us? Yeah, use them the way God told us to use them, right? Does that require wisdom? Yeah, you don't do that accidentally. That's not like human nature to just go out here and be gracious, but it does require wisdom upon our part. It takes, you know, processing what God has told us to do and then putting that into action in our life. And the least things that God gives us here on this earth are money and possessions. Now, I know as humans, to us, that's like it. That's the top thing that God gives us, right? But the way that Jesus describes them is this idea of, you know, these little things, these minor things that God has entrusted into our care. And I know I say this quite a bit, but I'm going to say it again. You know, this life is a test. Okay, God gives us these little things, these minor things, and He says, this is what I want you to do with it. Can He trust us? Are we going to be faithful with what God told us to do? Are we going to use them in the way that God told us to use them? Because Jesus said, if we can't be faithful to God here upon this earth, how can God expect us to be faithful to Him in heaven? He can't trust us now. We can't pass the test here upon this earth. How is God going to trust us whenever we get to heaven? And so the principle that he talks about there, the main principle is the idea of faithfulness. These money and these possessions, again, to us as humans, are kind of big things, but they're nothing when you compare them to eternal things. And so how can God trust us with eternal things if He can't trust us with temporary things?
What's that look like to you? So is that just giving your percentage? You designate your mind out of your checks? You expect you to spend all your retirement? What does that look like in your daily life?
Yeah, and I think there's an area of your life that's dedicated to that. You read about rich men. Abraham was a rich man. I mean, we read about him. Was he a generous man? Yeah. Did he give God his due? Did he pay tithes? Yeah. Did he judge him faithful? Yeah. I mean, there has to be, and again, I don't think, I appreciate the question, because I don't think it's this idea of we just take every dollar and every cent that we have and, give it away. That'd be good if we were that liberal, if we were that generous, but in reality, we're probably not. But in God's law, there's always these roads. One of those areas in our life has to be not tithing, it's tithing in the Old Testament, but giving to God. Okay? That's one of the ways we show our faithfulness. Is that all we're supposed to do?
No, we're supposed to have works with that faithfulness.
Okay, if I see somebody on the street, and or I know somebody, one of my fellow brothers or sisters in Christ, see them in need. James says they need something to eat, they need something to drink, they need some clothes. What's my obligation? You'll say, well, I gave on the first day of the week. That's what that money's for, right? They need to go to the church building and talk to the elders. I think there's another area in our life when we're supposed to be generous people too, don't you? And again, I don't think the Bible teaches us that means you devote every dollar and every cent that you have to the Lord. You can't buy anything for yourself, or you can't enjoy life at all. Again, Abraham was a rich man. Job was probably the richest man to ever live. And he was one of the most faithful servants of God that we read about in the Bible. But again, did he give God his due? Was he generous? Yeah. And so I think sometimes as Christians, we're either all in or we're not in at all. And there's kind of a happy medium in there. So, yes, sir.
When you think of sins associated with money in the Bible, you think of particular things. I mean, I'm thinking of those that hoard money to themselves, those that present themselves as something, special because of their money. There's several things that are like recurring themes, I think. Put all your trust in that.
Yeah.
And then it was like the corners of the fields. That was a living thing, like you say. They had to put the corners of the fields back every so often. That they were supposed to give their whole harvest to the poor. But you still took care of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, there was still money that they used for themselves. I mean, there's no question about that. And yeah, you bring up a good point. Just think about the story of the rich man and Lazarus. You had a guy who was filthy rich. Every day he walked by a guy he could have helped. Right. And he just didn't help him. Right?
He's fine.
Yeah. He can beg and get what he needs from somebody else. But yeah, there's opportunities for us, and God has told us, when those opportunities arise in our life and we're able to help, do it. Reach out to those who are in need. So Jesus talks about this idea of it's impossible to serve two masters. Why is that the case? Question 9 here.
Because it is. It's just, there's no way around it. You can't.
Yeah.
You can't be true to two people.
Basically, it's like trying to walk in two opposite directions at the same time. It's impossible. There's just no way that we can do it. Money is either going to be our servant or it's going to be our master. And if money is our master, then we can't be a servant of God. We have to make money our servant in order for God to be our master. So you read about in verse 14, the Pharisees are upset now. Jesus has started talking about their pocketbooks and their money, so they become upset. The question is, why were they upset with what he was teaching? Yeah, it bothered them because they were guilty, right? If they weren't guilty, would it have bothered them what Jesus said? You know, if they were doing what Jesus told them to do, would have got under their skin? The problem was they loved money. And one of the things that I've learned as a Bible class teacher and a preacher over the years, when people generally take exception to what the Bible teaches on money, you know why they do that? It's not because they're doing what the Bible says, right? Or they wouldn't have a problem with it. It's because they're guilty. You know, they're greedy people, they're covetous people, just like these Pharisees were. And so they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear what the Bible has to say. And these people didn't like what Jesus had to say about it either. So how do these Pharisees try to justify themselves?
Trying to do it for men.
Yeah.
And the thing about it is that God knows their heart. He knows all our hearts. And that's really, you know, that's where the rubber meets the road kind of an idea. It's the whole idea of what's in our heart, what we do. We know God wants us to do.
Yeah. God looks at people a lot differently than we look at ourselves and others. And of course, the way that these Pharisees tried to feel better about themselves is they tried to appear righteous in the eyes of men. In other words, when they were out in public, they wanted people to look at them as being individuals who were close to God. And so, kind of ironic, but they were willing to use their money in front of men to secure the favor of men. But they weren't willing to use it to secure the favor of God. And so that's kind of, again, one of the hypocritical things, or one of the main things that Jesus condemns about the Pharisees is the fact that they are hypocritical. So question 12, what does God think of the things that we typically value? Verse 15. Yeah, many of the things which are sought and admired by men today are hated by God. And it's just another one of those examples where, you know, the way that we think, we kind of talked about as we began tonight, but the way that society thinks about things and the way that we view and feel about certain things, it's not necessarily the way that God feels about it. So Jesus, verses 16 through 18 there, we don't have much time, but we're going to get Matthew 19, I think, in a couple weeks here, so we'll talk a little bit more about marriage and divorce then. But what does he say about the law here? Question number 14. What is easier than for the smallest stroke of a pen to pass in the law? What did he say?
Easier for them pass away than this change.
It's easier for heaven and earth to end, to perish, to be destroyed, than for one small letter of the law not to come to pass. He talks about how John was kind of this dividing line between the law and the prophets and the kingdom of God. And a lot of Pharisees had the idea that Jesus' attitude toward the old law is destroy it, get rid of it, right? But what was Jesus' attitude toward law? Was it erase it? Destroy it? No, his idea was none has failed. You know, it's all come to pass. It's all been fulfilled, just like the law and the prophets said it was going to happen. And so I think there's always a danger when you say, well, the old law has been fulfilled. That means you're free to do anything, right? All those laws they had in there, like divorce and remarriage, now we don't have to worry about them anymore. But Jesus says, no, there's some moral laws that are never going to change from generation to generation. It's always going to be wrong to unlawfully take the life of another person. It's always going to be wrong to steal. Is it ever going to be right to lie? God ever going to do away with that moral law? Some moral laws are never going to change. And marriage and divorce is one of those things that you want to know how it should work. Go right back to the beginning where Jesus said, Genesis chapter 2, where he took the Pharisees and said, this is how God set it up. This is how it's supposed to work. So we'll talk, again, a couple of weeks, we'll talk some more about that in detail. Anybody have any comments, questions before we end?
Well, I do think that the overriding thing is spiritual here, more than just money. It's the way we use our spiritual life here, because the Pharisees weren't it, period.
Yeah.
And it's, oh my God. And so God doesn't need our money, never has. But if we chase that side of it versus chasing the spiritual side, try to grow as a Christian.
Yeah, and yeah, I hope I didn't come across that way as trying to, that money is the main focus. That's part of it. And what we do also know this is, can we do what God told us to do today without money? It requires money, doesn't it? To do what God told us to do, it requires money. So that is part of it. But yes, Dennis, good point there. That's not the only thing, but it is a part of it. Okay.